Let's get started. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Clarisse Rojas, and we are going to be presenting a panel on community accountability and intersectionality. I'm going to just read a couple of paragraphs to introduce the sort of overview concepts that framed our approach to this panel and our work together, and then each of us are going to talk about community accountability and its relationship to intersectionality a little bit more. In some cases, we'll have case studies where we can look at the strategies that were employed and applied and think about whether those strategies were useful, effective, or not. And we're going to invite a lot of participation in sort of assessing that alongside you. Intersectionality theory enhances our ability to understand and disrupt the nexus of multiple forms of power and violence interacting against the well-being of a community. Difference and the recognition of multiple modalities of power legibly emerge through the application of intersectionality as the racial, gendered, sexed, queer, classed, national, able body is carved through violence. Thus, applied intersectionality actively reveals the multiple dynamics that produce violence within and against our communities. The lens of intersectionality reveals the collusion between heteropatriarchal, colonial, and racist state interests and anti-rape domestic violence movements. The criminalization of violence against women has co-opted grassroots political movements toward reliance on state interventions that, rather than yielding increased safety for women of color, queer, trans folks, and our communities, has instead increased our policing and incarceration. As a result, not only do our communities come under heightened attack through the prison industrial complex, but so do our abilities to conjure self-determined and autonomous communities with our own intra-community responses to violence. Nonetheless, community-based responses to both state and intimate violence against women have been practiced by survivors and our communities long before and alongside the rise of the prison industrial complex. In an effort to resist the deleterious impact the prison industrial complex has waged on our communities, the last 10 years has witnessed increased attention to crafting strategies that respond to violence within and against communities of color and social movements. In their pursuit of justice, the number of anti-violence organizations and other community groups intentionally doing this work has increased, and new methodologies and practices of accountability that recognize the violence of the accused and the violence of the state, as well as their interconnectedness, have emerged.
Hello, my name is Andrea Smith, and I'm a co-founder of Incite Women of Color Against Violence. And I must apologize that I am in a coma because I haven't slept for the last 2 days, so my comments may not be very coherent. But I just wanted to present a little bit from working with Incite how we have kind of approached the issues of community accountability and what some of the issues have been that have come up. So Incite Women of Color Against Violence started with many women of color who are part of the anti-violence movement, who were not just critical of the racism in that movement, but also how the movement had become very professionalized. Kind of to give the Reader's Digest version of this, when the anti-violence movement is developing, there's the sense that women can do something to end violence ourselves. It's a political issue. It's a political movement that we can ourselves transform a society that is structured on the logics of sexual violence. But the state, being the tricky thing that it is, comes in and says, you know, we'll help you solve that problem with a federal grant. But of course, when you start to accept these federal grants, you accept all the stipulations that go with these grants. So the federal government does not want to fund rabble-rousing activity. No, they want to frame the issue of violence as one in which survivors are sick and they need healing from somebody with a PhD or an MSW. And if there's going to be any advocacy work going on, we're going to frame the issue as a crime in which the issue will be adjudicated by the state, which will therefore not allow us to see the state as itself the perpetrator of violence against indigenous women and women of color. And of course, during this time, we see the buildup of the prison industrial complex, so it becomes very easy for the state to co-opt feminist rhetoric and use this to support the buildup of the prison industrial complex. By that, I'm not saying that the people in prison are largely batterers and sexual abusers, but simply that you now just need to attach a violence against women provision to a repressive anti-crime bill, and it gets heralded as feminist legislation. And certainly when we look at the crime control bill that the VAWA was attached to, it had many repressive measures targeting juveniles, targeting Native peoples around death penalty applications, etc., and yet there was no critique of this. It was just supported uncritically as feminist legislation. So then essentially what we see happening is that the violence against women becomes transformed from a political problem to a legal problem. Right? Rather than needing to build a political movement that would transform our society, it becomes a legal issue that the state will adjudicate. And we therefore do not recognize the fact that, say, if we look at indigenous communities, the reason why we have violence against women in our communities is because of the state. It is because of boarding school policies, it's because of the sexual mutilation of Native women and Indian massacres, etc., that we even have this problem in the first place. And yet now, miraculously, the state's going to be the solution to the problems that it has created. So in doing this, then, we start to get the idea that somehow state violence in the criminal justice system is going to be the problem for gender violence. And this kind of political contradiction leads to all sorts of ramifications, such as when the war in Afghanistan started, many feminist groups supported the bombing of Afghanistan because they said this would liberate women from the Taliban, because, of course, if you throw bombs on women, it will liberate them. But again, it was part of the same idea that somehow, in this case, state violence in the form of the military was now going to solve the problem of gender violence. And through all this process, then, we did not ask ourselves, does this actually do anything to lead to less violence? And here's where we see study after study from people from all across the political spectrum. It's not just a lunatic leftist fringe idea. I was at, don't ask me why, but I do stuff with the Christian right, so I was at this Republican shenanigans around the prison system, and all the Republicans said the prisons don't work. It wasn't like a great mystery, but they said we'd vote for it because otherwise we won't get reelected. So it's not something that's unknown that prisons don't generally do anything to lessen crime rates. And if we want to see why that's the case, well, why are people in prison? Crimes of poverty. What does a prison do but give you a prison sentence, make it less likely you can get a job? Crimes around drugs, where you can usually get drugs easier in prisons and there's no treatment facilities there. And if we look at the issues of violence, well, maybe prisons might make sense if there was a few wacko dudes we needed to lock up. But when we have studies in which half men say they would rape somebody if they thought they could get away with it, you either have to lock up half the male population, which is unfeasible, okay, or you have to say, well, wait, we have a larger problem here. We have a rape society, and we need a political movement that can transform that society. So basically, then, what has happened is that in our inability to recognize the state as a perpetrator of violence, we've made it the solution to violence, and we have then disempowered ourselves as people who could themselves change violence in our own communities. So with that, then, Incite started to do activist institutes to say, is there something we can do to end violence in our communities that's not first going to the police? And by that, I want to stress, I'm not saying that if a survivor is under attack, they should never call the police. To me, the question on the table is not, should somebody call the police? The question on the table is, why do they have no other options but to call the police? And why haven't we provided those other options? So in doing these activist institutes, what was very interesting in one of these workshops is one woman said, this is a problem I'm facing right now. There's violence going on in my apartment complex. There's a man beating his partner, and I don't trust the police, so I don't want to call them, but I don't want this violence to continue. And then when she said this, it made me realize how this criminal justice-centered approach to violence had actually not only isolated survivors of violence, but also isolated all of us who might think to intervene. Because if you ask because it didn't occur to her to organize the apartment complex to do something, right? So we ask ourselves, what can I do? There's not much you can do other than call the police or do nothing. But if you ask yourself the question, what can we do? Then all sorts of interesting ideas start to develop. And so we actually then started to create, through these activist institutes, started to accumulate various accountability strategies, and some of them started to organize into accountability projects. And of course, there's not some easy model solution like if you do this, violence will disappear, because really we're getting to the root causes of violence, ending global oppression, and it's not as easy as it looks, right? So this is more of a revolution through trial and error. And this gets back to the nonprofit industrial complex, which is another story. But the point is, part of the nonprofit model is that we get so invested in a strategy and getting funded for a strategy that we don't get to critique those strategies. And by trying to do this work outside the nonprofit system, it gives us more freedom to say, hey, we tried this and it failed miserably, so don't try it yourselves, right? In this case, we won't keep proliferating disaster, but we can actually learn from each other's mistakes and continue from this kind of politics of experimentation. In any case, as we started to do this work, we also were able to benefit from learning about different accountability models in other countries. And we found this important because in the U.S. we tend to have the idea that we have the most advanced ideas on all topics and everybody else needs to know about them. But in this case, what we noticed that in other contexts, there's no illusion the state's going to do anything for you. So people often have much more developed community accountability strategies because they have no illusion the state will do anything to help them. And so in learning from this, we realized that maybe we need to think a bit outside the box. And I'll just give one example of this, was the landless movement in Brazil. And they shared how when they are taking over, basically what the landless movement does is take over land that's not being used. And during this process, of course, if there's a problem, they can't call the police. So they have to develop their alternative governance system. And what they do is they have a man and woman in charge of each sector of society. And they have the women in charge of security who enforce it by carrying around machetes. And also leadership is rotating so that nobody has all the power. And in addition, decisions are done in a very transparent fashion. And as we know, abuse tends to proliferate when there's isolation. In any case, they said there's no panacea to the issue of violence, but they noticed that the longer an occupation happens and they live under this alternative governance system, the less violence happens in the first place. And I think that's instructive for us because we tend to think what to do after it happens, but what they are showing is maybe we can start to create worlds where the violence stops happening in the first place. And this is, again, where I think we could also be informed by indigenous models of governance, because if you think about it, the prison-industrial complex is really the arm of a nation-state form of governance that's based on domination, violence, and control. So when we're thinking outside the prison system, we're actually thinking of different ways to govern ourselves outside the nation-state. And here's where we can be informed by indigenous peoples who say we can understand nationhood differently, where we, instead of seeing a land as a commodity that can be bought and controlled by one group of people and you're out and we're out, screw the rest of the world, rather we can see ourselves in radical relationality with all of creation and all peoples, and in doing so, nationhood becomes an expansive concept rather than an exclusive concept. And then we start to see how we can be responsible for everybody. And in fact, at the 2008 World Social Forum, the consensus statement made by indigenous peoples from Latin America was that they said they wanted to put the nation state on the table because they said the nation state has not worked in the last 500 years, so we don't think it's going to start working now. They had an explicit feminist analysis about how it's particularly gender violent to women and how it's based on heteropatriarchal values. And also they said the key then that we're saying is not that everybody else has to leave. They said everybody is welcome, but you have to live in a different relationship to land. We have to live in a different way with each other, and in doing so we can create true democracy where we all get to be part of creating the future we want to live in rather than a few people supposedly representing our interests. So therefore, in conclusion, what we can see is community accountability then is really not just a quick fix solution, but it's actually putting a larger question on the table, which is how do we want to live with each other? How can we govern ourselves differently so that we end up creating a world in which violence starts to become unthinkable? Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to spend some time talking about a project that also has really been, I think I would consider part of the trajectory of responses that grew out of Insight Women of Color Against Violence, and in particular in its intersection with critical resistance. At the time that the critical resistance insight statement, or the insight critical resistance statement, depending on probably where that shows up, was carved out. It was really naming a territory that had been unexplored, which is basically the intersection between people that were primarily saw their struggle against gender-based violence and those, at least in the West, who primarily saw this as a prison abolitionist movement. And that what we found in the U.S. is we didn't have very many examples of people that had really been, I mean, maybe conceptually talking about that space, but when we looked at concrete kind of examples, these are some of the things that Andy was talking about. We really felt like we needed to start naming them and getting these examples from other areas where this actually has been practiced. One thing that I got involved in starting around 2004 was actually trying to see if we could create something that was more of an institutional space in the U.S. where we could practice this in primarily urban areas. And I live in Oakland, and that's where we started using this, the influence of a lot of things that the knowledge we had already been building as a community that was particularly organized with the opportunities that Insight afforded. But also I had been working in the anti-violence movement, particularly in immigrant communities, since the late 80s. I have to say, primarily spending a lot of that time replicating a conventional feminist model within immigrant communities, and really had increasingly been troubled by the kinds of limitations that we had been really keeping within our own communities when there were so many other kinds of options that could be available. So Creative Interventions is an organization that I and others founded in 2004 to really try to come up with just be another space where we would try to create some alternative models to the conventional feminist models that we have in the U.S. and within a structure of a 501c3. Now the structure of the 501c3, as we know, is problematic. And I could spend another session talking about kind of some of the decisions that we made to use that form, but also to use that form in a way that we use the resources we could organize for a short while and then consider ourselves to be moving out of nonprofit status, which is where we're at right now. So I wanted to share with you a little bit some of the results that we have from that. There's many different directions to go, so I'm just trying to, in preparing for this, trying to figure out the best way to talk about this in this particular space. We have two projects. So one of the projects that we have is around actually having a space to try out, having folks come from the community who were facing a situation of violence, and people that were looking for something that wasn't available in the already existing programs and interventions. And just seeing, what does that look like? So we had some kind of fundamental principles that we were starting with, that these would not be state interventions, that they wouldn't necessarily be social service interventions, that they would be collective, and that they would be holistic. And holistic can mean so many different things, but what we meant by holistic is that we would potentially be including everybody that was in that situation of violence. That would be the survivor, a person doing harm, people doing harm, the community as allies, and so on. So that's what we thought about holistic. Would we always be working with or engaging with all parts of that community, and it's a very, very fluid concept, obviously? No, but would we keep in mind a fluid community and a larger inclusive community in the model? Yes. So after 3 years of doing this, we're actually still writing up our kind of findings right now. We dealt with about 22 situations of violence. I think we met with over 100 people over that time. There were, sometimes it was somebody just coming in and only wanting to meet once, just to really have a space to think about what kind of strategies could they just even imagine, could they even brainstorm. And for other people, went pretty far in terms of bringing in other people, bringing in friends, bringing in coworkers, bringing in family. We had other situations where it was a person doing harm that might have started the process and just had heard about a resource that was available and really kind of wanted to sit there and have another space to help them figure out what their goals were and who they could bring into that room, who maybe they shouldn't bring into that room. And when I say room, we did have literally a room, but people sometimes just came to get some ideas because their room was going to be outside and they were doing that in another space. So I think that there was some real opportunity. Also, it was a collaborative project, so we brought together people primarily that were interested, were folks that were already working in an immigrant community doing anti-violence work. So most people in the space that were working together as a team were people that had quite a bit of experience already working in a, not necessarily completely conventional, but at least in a immigrant anti-violence context. South Asian, Pan-Asian group, a Korean group, a Latino group. And there were other parties that had more of the experience in the prison abolitionist movement and in working primarily with male perpetrators of violence. So we had a kind of grouping that actually, if you look at the anti-violence world, doesn't get together all that often. We met for 3 years, for twice a month, and really tried to construct. I mean, it was a very, very critical and a very supportive space in which we really tried to challenge each other on our own limitations around what is it that we're trying to do and really work together towards coming up, at least making advances in some of the collective strategies that we had been hoping to start creating in our own communities. So that's one of the projects, and I want to say that the other project that we had was knowing that so many people had already been doing this, whether it was in a community setting or whether it's even an individual or a family that just spontaneously did something just because they had nothing else that they could do. So we have a collection of stories right now that have come from a lot of different situations. Each one is extremely unique. And I thought what might make sense to do here is to share those stories, because what you get from the stories that you don't get from me talking about, kind of our project plan or the principles is what something could look like. Now each one is just a particular example, right? They're very, very incomplete. There's I don't know if anyone could be completely successful. Also, you're only getting a part of the story. So the stories that we got mostly were taken in interviews that would last anywhere between an hour and 4 hours. Some people had stories that really took years and actually were still under construction. Other people, it was something that was kind of a short event, so that was maybe a little bit easier to talk about in a shorter time span. So there's a lot of differences. So I just picked out one story, or actually it's two stories that is from the same person, to give you an example of what this could look like, but also some of the contradictions and problems that any one of these stories raise. So I've got, well, am I going to do that? Well, one of the stories is actually, will the audio recording be, will we be able to hear that?
There's sound.
There should be.
And if this doesn't work, I have another one I could just read.
Yeah, it should work. We need. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I can just do that.
Do you want me to get out of the PowerPoint? No.
Oh, now you have to look at my entire laptop. Oh, God.
Is it on the disk? Or
It's it's on the flash drive.
Okay, do you want me to just get out of the PowerPoint? Okay.
Sorry. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and read this other one while we're waiting. Okay, and then we can see how that works. As I said, these stories generally came out of audio interviews.
Is it Maria's story?
Yeah. Okay. Great. Why don't you just play that then?
I'm the mother of a son and a daughter. And I was in a relationship with a man whose job was a correction officer, and I think that that's important that I mention, who sexually molested my daughter. Now, my daughter did not disclose this until she was 22 and had a daughter of her own. But throughout those years, she became very estranged from me, separated from me. And I think that what hurt me the most out of all of that was that all of those years that she did not disclose, she thought that I knew that this was happening and was not doing anything about it. And I want you to know that when I did find out, I did try to reach out to the systems to help me, that I really wanted to prosecute him, but because so many years have passed, the statute of limitations did not allow me to prosecute, because I was ready then to collaborate with my daughter and to really, use the systems to make him pay for what he did. But the district attorneys didn't respond. It was too late. I went to his job, and I was pretty desperate. I went to the police. I was pretty desperate then, and at the time, the only thing that I could really think of in terms of holding him accountable for what he did, and now that I look at it, really protecting a community from somebody like that. So what I did was, at that time, I was in this business. I was doing, work around, working with women and what have you. I took his picture, and I remember putting with his picture a warning sign with his picture on it, and writing on there something like a warning: beware of child sexual abuse, are unable to prosecute due to statute of limitation. And I made sure that it was posted from his house all the way to where he needed to take his train, and or his community needed to take his train. There were hundreds of them. And I remember, sharing that later on, and some therapist telling me, I put myself at risk and at danger. But now when I look at that, I really see that as something that I needed to do. I later found out that not only did he sexually abuse my daughter, but so did my brother. Once she started disclosing. And I think that this came much later, once her and I came together as mother and daughter, that she could see that she could talk to me about these things, that she really started to disclose not only that abuse, but all of the abuse, the sexual abuse in her life. So then I found out that my brother had sexual abuse. And I was really determined to demonstrate to her that this is the way I would have handled it had I known. And so I called my brother. My brother doesn't live here. My brother is also a correctional officer, by the way. And I confronted him with it. I told my other siblings who also live in California with him about it. And then I told him I needed to talk to him about it. And I told him, I said, my daughter says that you did this, and this. And I believe her. His response was a quiet one. There wasn't much response, verbally or otherwise. They said that he was quiet. His wife was at this meeting. She was there. But there wasn't any denying. We have a good relationship, and she's really moving. She's a teacher. But now, because of our relationship and the work that I do, she's really, really moving towards doing work around social change, which could not make me more proud. And that has been something that has come from her, because she sees all the good that has come out of our experience. And she's taught me so much about forgiveness, and has given me, she pulls my coat and gives me permission not to hate the perpetrator. She says, Mom, we got to forgive and we got to move on. I've forgiven him. And you cannot remain there, because that just hurts you. So it's all been so worthwhile, to hear my daughter say, Mom, I'm just not there anymore. I'm not going to base my entire life around what happened to me. So we've moved and we've grown and we've developed together. And what it required of me was to, hold myself accountable. And holding myself accountable doesn't mean blaming myself. It means looking at the choices that I made, acknowledging those choices, and talking to her about, my intentions and things like if I had known. So I have the trust of my children.
Yeah, thank you. I think that story demonstrates that the power of stories over probably all the previous words I already said today. So this is one story among many. I think the story is powerful, no doubt. The story also illuminates some of the contradictions of what some of us might consider community accountability work. The difference between a perpetrator of violence that was someone who's no longer cared about versus one that's held and cared. The use of something that could be considered public shaming, or is it public disclosure? Is it public safety? So these are all things that that I know for us, when we have the chance to use this story in particular to really raise some of the questions that it brings up, but not to use those questions to incapacitate people, but to move people forward towards taking action. I think that Maria's words about accountability being, for her, another way of looking at accountability is her accountability, and her actually taking this project and using it to talk with other mothers that have been in a similar situation is a way that this story is used, and her work has been used as organizing just beyond just witnessing one story, but using it to kind of spark a whole another round of movement. So I'm just going to end with that, and if you have further questions, we could take that during question and answer. Thank you.
So I actually wanted to say a couple of remarks kind of in response to what I feel is this momentous occasion. Many of us here on this panel are actually co-founders of Insight, and we are just a few weeks away from the 10th year anniversary of the conference that first happened in 2000. And so one of the things that I'm thinking of as I'm listening to the other speakers is that the sort of historical framework for where we have gone and where the work is now. And as has been mentioned earlier, many of us were involved in the anti-violence movement. I came in the early 90s, literally at the height of a transformation that was so rapid towards criminalizing and really looking at the state to sort of respond to violence as the primary response. And at that time, similarly, I faced in my own work some contradictions that I could not resolve in my mind in the way that the movement was going and addressing its work. Namely, one of the examples was that I was working with specifically Latina women, and there was this woman that was an immigrant who was actually assaulted and beaten by an immigration officer. And so I wanted to kind of bring news to that and somehow involve the community in that work. And the organization's leadership literally blocked that, saying that that was not domestic violence, and therefore not violence or something that the organization did. And there was a turning point there around sort of the collusion that then the anti-violence movement began to have with protecting violence that manifests against women and women of color from the state. And that was a real eye-opener. And so that was really one of the initial moments of critique that led on to several years of trying to do this work in different ways. And then in 2000, when we first gathered, I think by then there was literally such a dramatic acceleration of the criminalization of violence that we spent the first year, I remember, just spanning the country, talk after talk after talk, just sitting with people and beginning to even envision in some way how we could even think about not using, right, the criminal justice system, because it had gotten to that point. And so then our work sort of bloomed from a growing kind of critical recognition of that kind of cooperative relationship and that criminalization and the concerns given the rise of the prison industrial complex alongside it. And we actually began then our work of thinking about building and re-energizing these community accountability practices, which then is sort of where many of us went and did our own work in different ways. So it's somewhat, of an interesting kind of reunion and historical moment that this occasion brings. And Katie has also been part of the recent formation, founding the recent formation of Insight Los Angeles chapter. So we're going to talk about, and this is sort of part of the approach to thinking about making change and thinking about organizing in every space of our lives, right? Not just sort of separating it to a particular space. So I was a teacher at San Francisco State University. I currently teach at Cal State Long Beach. Both experiences were in the Department of Chicano Studies. And I thought of using that classroom space as an organizing space. And through accident, which is, I think a lot of our work, as Mimi said, is quite at the experimental stage. And so which is one of the reasons we want to brainstorm alongside with you as well, what's working, what's not working, to kind of get that dialogue going. So we're going to talk about, Katie was actually working with me, co-teaching as a teaching assistant at the time in the course, and there was an admission of sexual violence in the course, and we ended up applying community accountability in the actual classroom. So I'm going to pass it over to Katie, who's going to talk a little bit more about that.
So, like Clarisse said, we were co-teaching a class together. I don't know if you remember the exact title, because it was a new title that you had come up with. But violence against Latinas was actually specifically part of the title. So we approached the class very much wanting to teach about, from an insight kind of political perspective, what it means to think about the interlocking nature of state violence and interpersonal violence. So probably about, I would say at least 2 months into the semester, we had already taught a significant portion of Insight's Color Violence Anthology. So the students had a significant background in thinking about state violence. They had thought a lot about violence along the border, about militarized rape, about femicide. We covered a lot. And part of their assignments, they had to choose an article or a particular text that we were reading and present on it. Just kind of short presentations about, what were the kind of analytics in the text. So we had gotten to the end of the anthology, and we were on one of the very last readings, which is CARA's text in the book. CARA's Communities Against Rape and Abuse. They're an organization based out of Seattle. Much like Creative Interventions, they do a lot of community accountability work. And so they have a text in the anthology about what does it mean to apply community accountability, and they lay out their different principles for community accountability. So Gabriel, who was one of our students in the class, had chosen this text to present, and when he began his presentation, he stated specifically that this was a text that meant a lot to him, that he had kind of a personal draw to the text, and that's why he had chosen to present it. So as the class kind of waited for his presentation to start, he took kind of a big breath and publicly admitted to the class that he was an aggressor of sexual violence, and that this sexual violence had occurred last semester with another Raza student, so another one of the Raza undergrads, at a Raza student gathering. We later recognized that that was Mecha conference that was going on. So a lot of the students from Mecha were at this conference, and they were kind of staying in a hotel. And as far as I know, there was drinking involved, and this party had happened, right? So the important thing, I think, is that Gabriel never really used the principles, right? He wasn't keen on applying the principles. He ended up using the space very much as a public confessional. He spoke for a significant amount of time, I would say easily 30 to 45 minutes before any of the class kind of got an entry point in. And a lot of his remarks were very much about astonishment, anguish, it's some kind of like indescribable disbelief. I can't believe I did this. I never would have imagined that I would have done this. I never could have seen myself as a sexual violence aggressor. So at some point, he kind of paused, and another student raised their hand. There was definitely silence, and another student raised their hand and said, so are you telling us that you raped this other student? And it was in this kind of turn of events, right? The second that this like mobilization of rape was put into the classroom space, Gabrielle immediately started backpedaling. It was, I don't know what happened, I don't remember what happened, I just woke up, I was on top of her, they told me the next day that it happened, I blacked out, I was drinking. So there was definitely this kind of like methodical backpedaling that, I mean, at best was confusing and at worst was manipulative. I think that, you know, as the class moved on, like I had said earlier, it felt very much as if he wanted to use the space and co-opt the accountability process into like a pardon, confessional, let me announce to you that I've done this awful thing, and if you can just absolve me of my wrongs, then we can, that's like what accountability means, right? Which is not what accountability means. So I think at that point there was a lot of kind of silence and not a lot of movement. I think the students were very much shocked, and the process kind of ended up being disrupted. So I don't know if you want to. Okay.
A couple of things I think to note, as well, is that his admission was. It was tricky in that it wasn't this constant. So there was a lot of shifting around the language that he used. He never used the word rape. He used sexual violence, and that movement, I think, in retrospect, helped me to think about sort of how community accountability practices don't necessarily proceed in a linear manner. That they're living processes shaped by the ongoing enunciations of intersectionality that continues, right, in those spaces. So the state is in our community accountability processes. Violence against women is in our community accountability processes, and constantly sort of rearing its head. So it's almost like in you know, doing community accountability, we have to sort of assume that violence is like the ever-present elephant in the room, if you will. That it became for us, I think, because we were sort of shocked. I actually happen to know quite well and have been a mentor of the person that he had violated. And so I knew as he was beginning his admission exactly the details from the other perspective that were unfolding. And so I was in the hot seat of trying to facilitate, as both we were, and yet sort of deal with all of that was emerging. But it's as if violence is going to be there. It's present as the elephant in the room, and it's almost useful then to expect it when approaching community accountability practices, to work with it, to maybe speak to it, to name it. And this is some of the work that we began doing, as you will see when we sort of further historicize what happened after that point. Now, just a few thoughts about how the violence is present, in particular in this space, right, and what does it mean to do community accountability in this space of a classroom in a university setting. So sometimes we like to think that certain spaces are nonviolent, right? So I think thinking about the university classroom as a space that's actually carved by the state, that's entrenched in legacies of Eurocentric colonial, sort of remaindered enlightened ideologies, thinking about that context that it sits in. As José Martí once said, nos encontramos en las meras entrañas de la bestia, that we are, when we think about the university classroom, we can talk about the academic industrial complex, or living literally in the belly of the beast inside that classroom, because that academic industrial complex is a very assessment of the beast that is the U.S. and how it operates in all these multiple spaces, including the university classroom. It's here that conquest is digested, our people's lives, beliefs, cultures, languages, bodies, remains are collected, acquired, accumulated, cataloged, subjugated. All that we are is masticated, chewed vehemently, swallowed, morphed, and manipulated into ultimately expelled byproducts, excrements of neo-colonial, neoliberal, heteropatriarchal, racist, reifying rhetoric intended to keep us all in our place. Habermas once talked about the formation of power and the formation of knowledge composing an indissoluble unity. Renato Rosaldo reminded us that institutions of higher learning tell the previously excluded, come in, sit down, and shut up. You're welcome here as long as you conform with our norms. Patricia Hill Collins also reminds us that hegemonic power sets out to displace subordinated epistemologies and replace them with hegemonic ideologies that legitimate the practices of the domains of power. So violence then saturates the classroom, the academic industrial complex. We can't pretend that it's this place of nonviolence. Edward Said also reminded us that the most readily accepted designation for Orientalism is an academic one. The university classroom is riddled with violence, a violent past that excluded our communities, a violent present that will not return sacred belongings to indigenous communities, and that produces moments like the recent Compton cookout, the even more recent racist Vatos Locos party happening at Washington State University as a spring break alternative to going to Mexico. And we also witnessed at San Francisco State, interestingly enough, around the same time, the arrest of Professor Antwi Akom in Africana Studies, who was, you see, walking into his office without proper identification. The incident took place just the semester before the course had started, and to add additional context and to thinking about this work at this time period, Virginia Tech shooting had just happened, which garnered an already post 9/11 increasingly militarized university campus, what some have, like Giroux has called the military-industrial academic complex after 9/11, even more militarization and surveillance after Virginia Tech of communities of color, which also led to an increase in sexual harassment that Latinas experienced on campus from the cops. Indeed, violence codes, surrounds, and carves the college classroom and exists in the classroom. The sediment of hegemony is not merely in context and history, it is alive and continually deployed. Every classroom is stifled by the bearing down and stitching of our classrooms with the coloniality of power. Thus, the classroom is also supposed to practice violence. Hierarchical organization relegating dominance to masculinized professoriate. It seems fitting to teach then the subject of violence, I think, doesn't it? And it seems necessary then to teach community accountability. How else will we survive in the spaces that Audre Lorde warned us we were never meant to survive, not as human beings? This classroom is also, I think, important to say, is marked with a legacy of resistance, the birthplace of ethnic studies at San Francisco State, ushered in by the Third World Strike. Raza studies, or Chicano studies, was a space of in search of decolonization, determined to assert the silenced narratives of our communities, determined to carve liberatory and transformative spaces amidst the colonial remnants of higher learning, nonetheless emerging out of a masculinist social movement. The heirloom of El Patriarcado, Chicano, is the site our Raza Studies, Chicano Studies classrooms still vie to rest ourselves. And thus emerges the only course in the curriculum, just one that focused on la mujer, appropriately entitled, at least it went plural, the prototype multiplied, the Raza Women, which I retitled for the semester, The Deployment of Gendered Violence in Chicano Latino Communities. So the course, it's important to say, was also anchored in community courses, or students were expected to do community service learning projects, and students were invited then to consider the multiple manifestations of violence as they are deployed in particular spaces in the community as they experienced it, and thinking conceptually about the U.S.-Mexico border, to prisons, to homes, streets, and we hadn't articulated the classroom yet. But interestingly enough, we hadn't planned or expected what would unfold, but that sort of happened somewhat accidentally.
Mm-hmm. So after Gabriel stopped talking, he kind of sat silent for a minute. The classroom expectantly looked between Clarissa and I and Gabriel, and then back to Clarissa and I, kind of waiting, right, for what was going to happen next. And I think what's important is that, as Clarisse had mentioned, we were just as shocked as the students. And I really want to clarify, though, shocked not in the sense of, oh my gosh, there's an aggressor in this classroom. I think it's foolish for us not to think about violence being ever present, right? Survivors are ever present, aggressors are ever present. Often survivors and aggressors might be the same people. So it wasn't so much a shock of, what are we going to do now? Somebody said something about violence, this is scary. It was more of a sense of, as much as we had been prepared to teach about violence and about community accountability specifically, I don't think we had developed quite yet a pedagogy for applying community accountability in the classroom. So the students were very quick on their feet. We invited them to do an impromptu community accountability session, and they, much as the CAR article is titled, Taking Risks, they took that risk and jumped in. The first principle that Cara points to in their article is to recognize the humanity of everyone involved. That's a really important grounding principle, right? Because the kind of premise behind community accountability is not to other the aggressor. It's not to turn this kind of like monsterness of the aggressor. It's definitely getting away from notions about criminality, right? And away from notions about prison industrial complex, about this is like, these kind of people are like really bad and we need to stop them and lock them up. But more recognizes that people are complex individuals, and as Gabriel ended up pointing out in his speech, and kind of also, I guess, coming out to, was that he himself was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. So we've talked a lot about what it means to not dehumanize aggressors, and I think Gabriel's admission of also being a survivor really kind of helped frame that for the students. He also talked a lot about inhibiting a kind of Latino identity as a man of color, what that meant for living in kind of a post-colonization era. He grew up in Honduras, and as far as I remember, he's in Guatemala, and he split his time between being there and in the U.S. So I think intersectionality, right, invites us to think like complicatedly about what it means to have intersectional identities and the different kinds of conditions of violence that get produced both through our like living out those intersectional identities and then also kind of taking on maybe violent conditions and reproducing them out into our own communities. So I think the second one that we talked quickly about too was self-determination of the survivor. So that's the second principle in the Cara text. And so for this, this was difficult because the survivor was not in the classroom. However, one of her very close friends who happened to be there the night that this act of transgression occurred was there, and she very much took up that space and really spoke out on her behalf and looked Gabriel dead in the eyes and was like, no, like, because he had been minimizing the violence, as I stated previously. It was like, no, you did this, and you need to hold it, and I was there, and I've been there, and this has affected her life. And I think at that moment, things started to shift. It opened up the space, right? So like this co-optation kind of like shifted away. Students felt more empowered to speak up. Another man of color started, really urging him to take accountability, to think through what it meant to say, like, oh, I don't remember what happened. I don't know what actually happened. So
and let me just point to really quickly also that in the classroom there was this kind of voiceless but very powerful opposition that a lot of the students were doing, and sort of we caught this kind of staring him down, right? So intervening in that kind of backpedaling in this nonverbal way. And I think he also was, interestingly enough, sort of kind of recusing himself but using the language of accountability in a manipulative way that was seeking to kind of gain some kind of notoriety. So there were some students that actually sort of praised him for admitting that and how hard that must have been, and all of these dynamics were present as this was continuing.
So moving into what happened after the class, because he had taken up so much of the space in the beginning, we didn't have a lot of time. When we started this impromptu accountability session, it was very limited in time. Our classes were on Wednesday night, so the students were definitely ready to leave. It was a hard space. It was very emotionally draining. I should also note there's one detail that I think is important. There was one student who actually got up and left the space. maybe about halfway through Gabrielle talking, she did not want to be there. And I'll come back to her story in a minute because I actually spoke with her later. But after the class ended, Gabrielle came up to us. We had a lengthy conversation with him about not minimizing the violence. I really urged him to go back and reread the principles, to think about what accountability meant, and challenged him to think about what it means to minimize violence. So for me, kind of an important tactic was telling him, can you imagine what it must have been like for her? Can you imagine what it would be like for her now to sit in this classroom and have you tell her, I don't remember what happened, something happened, but I blacked out, I'm not really sure what happened. So that was a good conversation I think that we had with her, or had with him, sorry. And after the class ended, we were supposed to leave to go on a spring break. We still had a couple days left of that week though, and I actually held office hours the day after our class on Thursday. So another important piece of community accountability, right, is to think about what it means to create safe space for everybody involved. So many people in that classroom were survivors of violence, and this was a very triggering experience. I know for Clarisse and I, it was very triggering. I know that for other students it was triggering, and I kind of had a steady stream of students coming to my office hours that next day. One was the woman that had left in the middle of the class. She was a survivor of rape. I had 3 other students come and disclosed to me their stories of surviving sexual violence. For many of them, they had never talked to anybody about it before. One of the students had the surviving that she had done was in her high school, and she was now a second-year undergrad, and she had never talked to anybody about it other than her friends. So there is this kind of, I think, balancing that you have to do to make sure that you're creating safe space for everybody involved. And then also, I think an important thing is the way in which community space shifted, especially in this context. It was very transient. There was no kind of stable space. It wasn't an office, everybody can come and this is where we're going to do our community accountability at. It happened in the classroom, but then it happened after the classroom. My office hours were outside of the Ethnic Studies building. I was a graduate student. I didn't have an office. So they were just kind of outside in, university community space. It happened through emails. It happened through phone calls. Many of the students had my cell phone number. So, community kind of shifts and changes and is very adaptable, and thus community accountability, the process that you develop, has to be able to kind of shift and change with how everybody's moving around at the same time. So the final thing about what happened after class was, again, more manipulation from Gabriel. He was a student who also had, I think all my students had my cell phone number, which now thinking back maybe wasn't the best idea, but he began to inappropriately text me, and I think a lot of this came out of the fact that I had come out to him as a survivor of domestic violence in the conversation we had after class. And I think that he really saw that as an entry point, right? So this is somebody that's vulnerable, I can use her, I can manipulate her. And he sent me we were talking about this last night, he sent me a picture of himself, which is just really strange. He sent me a text picture of himself, and he tried to be very flirty, very coy, and so that was just another, I think that shows how community accountability shifts and changes. New kind of triggers will come up, new microaggressions will come up, and you're going to have to adapt to those. So then there had to be kind of an impromptu accountability session over, you cannot do this, this is completely inappropriate, and you're only furthering this kind of minimization of what it means to perpetrate violence, right? So that was also important.
I think, we also thankfully had the text and the principles to turn to, so we really encourage the use of something that, is drafted like this to support the process, and we're applying as many as we thought were relevant and useful in this case. One of the items that we applied, I think, after the sort of fallout, realizing sort of what was the extent to what was happening in the classroom, was in the CARA principles number 9 that suggested identifying a simultaneous plan for safety and support for all of the survivors, as well as those who in some ways were reminded that they knew others that were survivors. So we kind of began to sort of think about not just the business of accountability, as also the principle I think suggests, but about what it meant to literally create a transformative space that was capable of doing both healing and community building work at the same time. And as we engaged in the process, I think Crenshaw's concept that she talks about in the area of rape, intersectionality provides a way of explaining why women of color must abandon the general argument that the interests of the community require the suppression of any confrontation around intra-racial rape, right? The kind of silencing that goes on within communities, not to out the perpetrator. And indeed, the survivor had expressed to me that in a separate conversation that she didn't want her family to know. That was the most important thing for her. This was one of the reasons among the many that she had chosen not to contact the police. Our experience took this insight on intersectionality, I think, a step further in retrospect. And I would argue that community accountability practices reveal that the interests of the community actually require the speaking and the transformation of internal discord and violence. So that community accountability models apply the interconnectedness, even interdependence, between community and violation, and urge us to then transform this mutual enunciation towards a peaceful feminist or decolonial community that is safe potentially for everybody. The survivor would later come and talk to me about how she actually did eventually speak to her family about her experience, which emerged as a move that seemed necessary for her because conflicts and tensions within the family were growing around her lack of participation in school. She had actually chosen to literally drop out of school, drop out of community organizing. So she stopped participating in Mecha, feeling that these spaces were not safe, didn't want to run into him. There were small community spaces with the Latino students. And so she felt that in a way mitigating this with her family, it was central, and it became central for her to build that relationship with her family, to actually express what had happened.
So the fallout, I think, is a good term to use because, so imagine now this class has occurred, this is in a very short time frame, and then I had the office hours the next day, and other students had also been contacting Clarisse, so there was kind of a now what do we do? Both as teachers, both as community organizers, as folks that had a very strong political commitment to ending violence against women of color. So the idea then was to continue the community accountability process. So Clarisse crafted this really amazing email to our students, letting them know that somebody had come up to us and said that there were many things left unsaid, many things that they wanted to continue talking about, and kind of invited them to continue a community accountability process and really rigorously work through the principles that Kara lays out in their article. We kind of went back and forth, decided that this was the best option, sent the email to the students. We had spring break, and so we returned in 2 weeks. And we returned strong. These students were invigorated. They were pissed off, definitely, and they were ready to talk. So the interesting kind of flip that happened was that Gabriel said nothing during this class. He just sat there, and these students, we're calling it survivor speak, right? So many students just looked him dead in the eyes and was like, I feel like you're not really holding yourself accountable to this violence that occurred. Other students shared their own stories about surviving violence. I think that was very difficult for him to hold, listening to another survivor say, this is what I experienced, this is what happened to me, this has detrimentally impacted my life. So that's really what we did during the second class. During the third class, that's when we did, what did we do during the third class? Was that the lecture? No, that was the principles. So during the third class, we went back through all the principles and really kind of mapped them out. One of the principles, I'm not sure if it's number 7, asks you, right, to like develop really clearly what it is, like what is accountability. We say that word a lot. It gets used in a lot of different spaces, but like what is accountability? Is accountability just that person says, now I'm going to hold myself accountable, right? So the goal is to really formulate specifics for what you would want the aggressor to do. So I know in the text they say different things like, if it's somebody that's a community, or if the aggressor is a community organizer, maybe you tell them like, you have to step down from the leadership, and if you come to one of our like fundraisers, you're not allowed to be alone with anybody. Different things like that, really specific kind of guidelines for what accountability is going to look like. Our students, on their own, identified that they wanted him to go and work with an organization in San Francisco called Men Overcoming Violence. They wanted him to use his community service learning component for the class to do that work. And then he ended up also working with PCOVI, which is a Latino-based aggressor counseling / organizing group. And then the final class, or you want to speak about that?
That was the lecture. Yeah, let me say something that in some ways kind of shaped how this progressed. That we had the task then of facilitating this process, but also of kind of rupturing the construction of this sort of unequal hierarchical classroom space, right? So our task was also to kind of develop the collective process and support and empower the voice of students who might be disempowered by the offering of grades. So it's interesting that I just, in reading over that email that I sent out, I actually said that I was suspending grades for the time, for the period of time that we were doing this work, right? So they were invited to do assignments or work that was suggested, but without a grade attached to it. So trying to kind of disrupt that inequality that was there and really think about how to build community there. The third class focused on lecture, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it did sort of consider, in general, violence against Latinas. And I think one of the key points in the principles of community accountability talks about everybody having the same level of knowledge in the room around what is violence. And so we began to define what violence is, and it was a very, all the classes were highly interactive, and the students, as we went through all of the principles in the prior class, chose which ones we were doing right, which ones would apply to our case, which ones wouldn't, and came up with their own suggestions. The class had, as Katie mentioned earlier, some consciousness around violence, but it was clear through the process that we needed further understanding. So we began to kind of, in some ways, sort of build through lecture and then continued dialogue, shared understanding around law enforcement violence against Latinas, medical violence, globalism, colonization, patriarchy, and literally thinking about even violence as the very genesis of Latinidad through sort of rape and colonialism, and how that continues to shape our experiences. And his sort of connection to Guatemala is key because Guatemala, in the period in which sort of he was born, right, was in the midst of this very brutal civil war that marks as one of the sort of highest genocides in the continent, certainly in the 20th century. So this shapes very much, I think, who Gustavo is, and is a factor that became very important for us to see. And I think just the last point to say is that through this process we began to see how the classroom was not a fixed, isolated community, and that in fact, as a community space, it was actually porous, and there were adjacent or other spaces, both temporal, like relevant histories, but also spatial, like the office hours spaces, or like even the Mecha space, right? And the Mecha student organizers at the time, interestingly enough, actually were working with me also to figure out a way to deal with a kind of masculinized violence against women that they felt had been inherited by the organization. So we were meeting with these students constantly and separate from the classroom, right? And they were also working alongside PCOVI and other organizations that were helping them to sort of develop a feminist praxis. So interestingly enough, all of these multiple spaces, including social movement work, were somehow connected to both, I think, what happened, the very production of violence, right? Connected in that university classroom was actually dorms where the incident had taken place, right? So all of these were kind of extensions of that space, and we felt that in the community accountability process, we needed to kind of reach out and think about making change at all of these different levels to really think about what led to the production of this particular moment.
So just the kind of final remarks, I think, have to do with outcomes. So I think kind of building on what Mimi had said, this isn't like an end-all be-all process. There is a lot to learn about community accountability. We have a lot to learn about what the process looks like and what works and what doesn't work. Our outcomes were both, I don't know, good and bad. It's not the best dichotomy, but he did complete his community service hours with Men Overcoming Violence. He did end up volunteering and working with PCOVI. He, however, did not finish his classwork, and indeed he stopped coming to class probably right after the last lecture, the masculinities lecture. He might have come to one more class, and then he stopped coming and developed sickness. He was always sick. The other important thing is that because he didn't finish his classwork, he requested to have an incomplete, and so we talked it over, and we wanted to be careful about wielding kind of like this academic power over his life, and so developed a plan for how he could finish his coursework, which he also didn't do, and eventually he went to the chair of the department over Clarissa's head and talked to the chair of the department and talked her into giving him a grade, and the chair also didn't talk to Clarissa about that. So that's like a difficult outcome to deal with and grapple with. I think the only other thing, I don't know if you want to say.
It actually was in results sort of this interesting moment where kind of that hierarchy, right, because it was the chair of the academy, ended up sort of participating in this collusion where he was evading accountability in a certain way, right, through accessing that hierarchy.
And then I think Clarissa had already mentioned this, but also, you know, the kind of negative consequences that the survivors had to live with. She, like Clarissa said, she dropped out of school. Clarissa has kept in contact with her since, and this is something that she's very much still struggling with. The only final remarks I want to say are kind of like future applications, I think particularly for law students and lawyers. I think importantly, we need to challenge ourselves to think about what work do we do? Like, what do we do when we say that we're a civil rights attorney? What work do we do when we say, I work with the ACLU and I do anti-racial profiling? What work do we do when we say we do immigrant rights? Violence is ever present, right? So I think it's important to think about how do you kind of own that, right? So if you're working with you're a public defender and you're working with somebody, regardless of whether or not the charge is about violence, maybe it is about domestic violence, how can you institute principles of community accountability in that work? You do immigrant rights law and organizing, and you think, I don't do domestic violence work, I don't do sexual violence work. What happens when one of the other people comes to you and says, my partner is abusing me, and that person's a leader, has some kind of leadership role in the organizing work, right? So I just really hope that folks kind of walk away from this thinking more about how we are all, right, part of these like political conditions of violence. What we do, like kind of the collusion that we have, and maybe allowing conditions of violence to further and fester. And we can talk more about that in the question and answer, but I don't know if you want to talk about pedagogical applications.
We probably should.
Should stop. Okay. So we're going to take questions?
So I think this, we'll wrap that part up. And forthcoming actually is a journal that an article on the topic might include, a journal that some of us are working here on through social justice, a special issue on community accountability. We wanted to open it up for questions. We have some particular questions that we would like to also invite you to participate and share dialogue with in terms of a reflection for where we're at around community accountability to build knowledge together. But initially, I think before posing any of those questions, if there were any, initial questions and thoughts or responses.
Well, I'm actually also adjunct in Cal State Long Beach in Asian American Studies, and maybe it's because Chair John Shuda and I are both lawyers, but what was the reason for not involving, police, understandably, the victim doesn't want to, but addressing other ways of creating, because there are legal mechanisms for accountability. Getting her a restraining order, or getting her hooked up with organizations for domestic violence counseling, because it sounds like there was a deliberate strategy to keep it within reason why like there wasn't that intersection of the legal mechanisms? Like even I would say that if this happened in a community service department, that the Title IX officer should have gotten involved as well. Was there a particular reason why that was not?
Well, I think the first response I think I would definitely have is that the survivor explicitly did not want law enforcement involved. That was a very much where she was coming from. She did not want police involvement at all. So I think, going back to some of the principles of community accountability is to center what the survivor needs and wants. If she had come to Clarisse or any of her friends that were kind of working with her through this process and said, I want a restraining order, I want to go to the police, I feel strongly we would have supported her in that move, but that's not what she wanted. I don't know if you want to...
I think there's also the context, and this, just Historis has a time frame, this was like about a year and a half before, 2 years before that class actually took place. But I think, the class was also very concerned with and framing the framework of colonial violence, right, and the ways in which law enforcement functions to sort of hyper-imprison our communities in particular, and critical of what kind of real transformation that might have in terms of potentially ending violence. So we were exploring all of these possibilities, but the context also that I mentioned earlier around the hyper-militarization that was happening post-Virginia Tech, certainly post-9/11, of the police presence on campus had actually resulted in increased violence against women on campus, right? So it's a tricky kind of relationship where some of the potential legal solutions also have very serious deleterious implications for everyone involved, right? So we were kind of brainstorming how we could intervene and potentially transform, right? Literally do some healing work and do transformative work around violence as it emerged.
Thank you so much for your panel. It's helped me think through some things that I'm struggling with. So I want to ask about the initial framing of the critical resistance and the site joint statement. And I can't remember the number of it, where it says, we haven't fully been able to account for specific kinds of murders, certain kinds of crimes that are excessive. And even on the sort of back for critical resistance, it still says, yes, it says they're only, murders are only sort of less than 1% or something, and that's totally true. And so it sort of focuses on all of the other ways in which we should, the kinds of people that we need to focus on, relationships with this industrial complex, but still doesn't address that population. So that's a challenge for me because I do work on child murder, okay? So I want to ask you, because I've been thinking through the Anthony Soul case. Are you familiar with that in Cleveland? Last October, an African-American man who had, they discovered late October, they had 11 raped and murdered women in his house. Very, they've been there for years. The neighborhood smelled really bad. Heat smelled really bad. They thought it was the sausage store next door. They also think that there were some murders prior to him. And it's really interesting in terms of state violence and community accountability, because the women who had survived him escaped, refused to talk to police, largely because he specifically targeted women who were more vulnerable with drug addictions, because he knew that they wouldn't talk and say specifically to them, knowing what he did this year. And the common things people say, well, you smelled this in the neighborhood. People didn't know what dead bodies smelled like, even though they've been decaying for years in the neighborhood. They don't, what does it mean that people were so sort of disenfranchised from their space that they couldn't even speak about the smell in the community? What does it mean about seeing these women who disappeared that women know, and they didn't sort of account for that? So there are ways in which you can clearly see particular kinds of community strategies that can be used to address this. But there's also someone who was incarcerated for about 10 years. He had crimes going back over 20 years, and the only time he didn't commit crimes was when, even when he was in the military, he also committed crimes then. So my question is, what do you think about accountability when we think about issues of survivors and community survivors, when punishment is a part of what reparative justice looks the highway peers, the daughters of Jonas, I mean, just Latin child murders, there are all these spaces where people say the absence of the state is part of the harm. And then the second question is that sometimes I feel that the discussion of community accountability treats the psychology, and I'll intentionally use this word, the pathology of offenders the same. Because what we know is that actually all offenders aren't the same, their motivations and everything. So incest fathers are the easiest to integrate because they want to be, and to be accountable because they want to go back to their families and their communities. So I wanted to, if you could address both that, the punishment issue and the psychology and the sort of, in some ways also the homogenization of community accountability in the current framework, as I've seen the most recent ones.
Well, I'll just start off with one thing. That's why I think, to go back, that I think prison abolition is a positive project and not a negative project. It's not a tear down all prison walls tomorrow. It's about squeezing it out with other things that work. If nothing else is working, like I said, if somebody's under attack and they decide they need a restraining order, it's not our job to say, don't do that, right? Our job is to start to create other things. And obviously we know that there's no essential as serial murder. It's itself a creation of a heteropatriarchal violent state that perpetuates itself. But since that is an order, since that world currently exists, right, it's not going to disappear tomorrow. And so the child serial murder is somebody who may be in prison at this point in time, but that doesn't stop us from creating the alternatives that end up creating a different world that maybe produces less child murderers as we go on. So I think instead of thinking about, oh my God, everybody's going to run free, what do we do now? I think instead we start to say, let's start to create that alternative. We're realizing that's going to be a slow process.
I think one comment too around sort of the absence of the state with regards to the emergence of violence against women, that in the case of Juarez, for example, this notion of impunity, no one's holding anybody accountable, everyone's getting away with it. But I think it's interesting to think about how the state is very much present there, right, and very much has shaped literally the space that is the Juarez borderland reality, especially post-NAFTA 1994, right, and continues to make decisions that are about prioritizing private interests over the safety of workers and women. And so I think reading how the state is actually an active player in the deployment of violence in a way that might not seem obvious, rather than just sort of absent, right, is an important kind of additional layer of analysis, I think, for this issue, right?
I'm going to just add another thing, because I know this is a thing been discussing a lot in Native communities about thinking about what happened prior to colonization. And one thing frequently mentioned is that the assumption is that community accountability is somehow easier, when in fact just because there wasn't a prison doesn't mean there wasn't punishment in certain cases, right? So I think this is something that I think we just need to think about. In other words, I don't have the answer, but I don't think we necessarily should equate community accountability with singing Kumbaya.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I think that should be an open question of what community accountability might mean, and not have a prescribed notion of what those kind of processes may be.
I guess I wanted to address that point in this way, is that a lot of us that are doing this on-the-ground work and across different situations of violence, I mean, this is a question around kind of how much do principles and methodologies, how much can we kind of use something that's somewhat consistent across a lot of different communities, like that you were able to use a set of principles that Cara came up with in Seattle and made it useful for what you were doing is one piece of evidence that, that we are actually constructing a movement across local and particular situations that makes sense in a certain way. I mean, I think that some of the work that we're doing in Oakland also looks at, are there processes around like mapping allies? I mean, it's a lot of what we do in our work, and right now I'm dealing with a situation in my personal life where I'm like trying to apply some of those same things. How does this work around a methodology of organizing? In which case you do have people that are very, very different. Some of the situations with somebody with a pretty serious mental illness. And yet we have found that we can use some similar principles and methods of approaching a situation of violence that take those things into account. I mean, I don't have the end answer for that, but I do think that there's something in that doesn't uniformly say, oh, we have a uniform solution that homogenizes. I think part of what we're trying to do is come up with community-specific situations that take into account how those actors know each other, what kind of leverage they have, what kind of resources, including compassion, knowledge, and conviction and outrage. You know, those are all resources that I think we can use towards creating solutions in particular situations that we can share across situations, so we could see, oh, that sounds like what I did, that doesn't, and create something that's bigger than what we have right now because it's so emergent.
You can have.
I don't quite know how to phrase this question, but I suppose it's useful since we're discussing specifically intersectionality. In sort of the way that aggressors justify their aggression when they themselves exist within intersectional identity. So when they utilize one piece of identity, disability, or race, or class, or some combination of those to justify and explain and manipulate it the same way that your student did, to also, in a very sophisticated critical racial lens, explain why those pieces of identity are more vulnerable than women. And so then to sort of create a hierarchy within those identities that further justifies gender-based violence. And I don't know how to think about that. Probably too far.
I think one issue in intersectionality, we often think of it in terms of identity, and I think maybe that's not always the best way to look at it. And I think of it more as intersecting logics of domination, because when that happens, we realize that there's no identity that's more innocent than another identity. In fact, these interlocking systems keep us all complicit in dominating other peoples, right? And I think one of the issues when we've been very identity focused is that it tends to equate oppression with innocence or a moral superiority, and so we all compete to be the most oppressed person. And I think that's kind of hit a wall at this particular moment, and in fact our project together is not to me just about where we're commonly oppressed, but where we are set up to be complicit in each other's oppression. And I think in doing so, and also in doing so, I think we have to do less of kind of the recovering racist or whatever approach. You know, let me confess my whatever privilege. Well, let me confess my privilege. Like, we already knew you had that privilege. Like, we're not more anything new here. But the problem is that it individualizes the problem, rather than if we're thinking communities of accountability, organizations of accountability, we then think of how is our group setting certain privileges. Like, what can our group do together, right? Because then it gets a little less out of the individual guilt trip. How dare you have a college education? And more a question of, well, hey, is our organization privileging people who have a college education? And if so, is there a different way to structure our work so that that doesn't happen? So I think when we talk about these issues of oppression, we realize we're all complicit, but also we need to collectively think about how to undermine those structures. And I think that gets us less out of that kind of rhetoric, has less meaning in that kind of way.
When you first started the conversation, you were talking about the problems with nonprofits, and right now I'm president of one of those problematic nonprofits, the California National Organization for Women, and it's 40-something years old and has basically outlived its purpose. And it's been purposeless for about a decade now. And I've been trying to figure out what do you do once you realize this? And I'm very interested to hear you explain a little bit more about what is it about 501c3 status or just the institutionalization of an organization that kind of just ends up just wanting to perpetuate itself where it's just for perpetuity.
Do we have any chalk here? No.
Andy, you do.
Okay.
Let's go.
So this is the problem with the nonprofit system. Okay, first we could have a critique of the Ford Foundation and all that stuff, but then the question becomes, well, what about nice foundations, et cetera? So I think the question is actually what happens when your organization is funded by foundations, no matter how good they are, versus your constituents. And this is where you get the big contradiction here. I'll just there we go. So my helpful diagrams on the nonprofit industrial complex. So if our basic problem is that 5% of the population owns 95% of the wealth, the bad news is they have all the money and the guns, but the good news is there's a lot more of us than them. But this tells us right away what our political imperative is. It's not enough to just work with activists who already think like us. We need to get people involved who don't already think like us. So we need to be growing our base as we go. Well, obviously, if you're getting funded by a foundation, you don't have an incentive to get more people. But if you're funded by your constituents, you do, and you're going to be more likely to be a growing movement. And again, the accountability then becomes to the foundation, who supports short-term goals that look good, have good photo ops, right? But to do this work, it's very boring. It involves a lot of door knocking and talking to your neighbors, etc. It's not that flashy. It might take 50 years. But this is the work you need to do to actually build the base. Then the problem is you're talking about how the organization has run its course. Well, when we have the nonprofit model, we become very focused on organizational survival and not movement survival. Right? It may be okay for an organization to stop. It doesn't have to exist forever. The importance is that the movement keep growing. So this is from Paul Rojas, who explains in Latin America how they have understand the nonprofit industrial complex. So they say that we're kind of here on the highway of capitalism and other evil things. Okay. And we're driving along in our SUV cars, gas guzzling, destroying the environment, and we're feeling a little cranky about this situation, But the problem is we're living in the belly of the beast, and the system cannot afford for us to be seriously organized because we could really transform the system. But also because we're living in the belly of the beast, there's a lot of money here. And so what the system is able to do is they use this money and they build as an alternative highway. And the alternative highway, we get to drive in our Toyota Prius car and feel very countercultural and very smug about this while we're eating our vegan burgers or whatever. And we fail to notice that we're driving around in circles. They built the highway for us, and this highway is still going along, right? So therefore, we end up getting funded to do things that make us feel better, but don't actually fundamentally challenge the system, right? That said, I'm not really espousing a purist thing, like never ever talk to a nonprofit, and because frankly, we need day jobs somewhere, and you're going to be stuck in some industrial complex. I don't think there's a place of purity to do the work. But in other contexts, what we learn is it's not that in other places that have huge movements that they don't use nonprofits, but they don't do the organizing through the nonprofit. They develop independently funded social movements that on occasion may set up a front nonprofit to get a specific goal, but the nonprofit answers to the movement. It's not the movement itself. And if it gets defunded, they're not screwed, right? So nonprofits could be helpful. They could be a cover for a movement. They could provide specific kinds of funding and resources. But what if we stop trying to organize through them and think about how do we develop a movement that nonprofits may be able to support? But check out The Revolution Will Not Be Funded for more details.
That's the other Insight anthology. So there's a whole other anthology that's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded.
Right. The nonprofit industrial complex.
Do we want to take one final question?
Yeah.
It still bothers me that this man who created this horrible situation basically did it with impunity. I mean, he went and did a little community service, and I didn't hear anything in what you said that there was any likelihood that he was really taking responsibility, or that he was going to change his behavior, or that he had anything like the depth of pain in, just from his own, reflecting on his own malfeasance compared to what the victim felt, you know, and I love this idea, but, you know, the perpetrators, you know, they get my jaws tight, you know?
Yeah. Can I start? Okay, so I think these are the kind of pushbacks that I think we hear a lot when it comes to community accountability. I don't in any way think that they're unfounded or not critical or not important kind of contributions to think about what it means to be doing community accountability work. I think that the kind of question is when, and this is something we've been talking about, is when does community accountability end? Right? So I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure when you get to some kind of like culmination, aha, this person is now accountable. I'm not sure what that looks like. I definitely think that it changes depending on the context. And there is some kind of transience that's going on in terms of creating space for community accountability. I mean, neither of us are at that university anymore. Neither of us even live in the Bay anymore. I know that I had some continuation talking to Gabrielle after the class, but not anymore. So those are questions to be on the table. But what I want to stress is that I don't think then that should be the kind of like, well, then we shouldn't try this. Because I think what Andy's talking about, and I'm sure, but I think what Andy was really getting at, right, is that it's not to say like tomorrow, I think critical resistance gets this a lot too. It's not like tomorrow we're just going to shut down all the prisons and everybody's going to be like living happily singing Kumbaya. I think the question is like, what does it mean to creatively think about what an alternative intervention would look like when the state is so ultimately invested in making sure that subordination continues. So.
And I think, too, to think about community accountability doesn't just, yes, we think about what's going on with him, whether he learned. I would hope that he did, just even the session where he heard a lot of testimony, right? But I think thinking about community accountability is also bigger, right? How much change happened in other spaces because of this, and with the students that participated. So they reported back to us having learned incredible amounts, being transformed by the class, right? The very state organization, MECHA, right, that even the conference that had been host to this transgression, and many others probably invited me to come and do a keynote speech actually at the next year's conference on violence against women, right? The couple of years after that, MECHA continued, the San Francisco State version of MECHA continued its work to deal with violence in their organization, and also invited me to come and speak at all of their graduation ceremonies for 2 years in a row about this issue in particular, right? So I think thinking about the ways that we were able in some way to sort of build collectivity, you know, practice collectivity. These folks participating in the process practiced that against the kind of hyper-individualized context of I'm here and getting a grade in my class and don't know how to actually, you know, care about or be involved with this framework of a kind of a social space within this place. But also think about all of the multiple adjacent, like I said, intersecting spaces, right? Or intersecting spaces that also were transformed through the process of community accountability.
I think the only final thing I think I'll say about that is that I think it's important to remember, right, that the way that the prison industrial complex works is through an individualization of the perpetrator, right? So it's like this individualized response. We will put this one person away, usually over 200 miles away from their home, and it'll be about punishing them, and then it's over. We're all absolved. The entire community is absolved of what happened. We don't have to think about what we did to help create and further conditions for violence to occur, right? And so community accountability is premised not just on this kind of like unidirectional retributive or kind of punishment model, but is more based on transforming political conditions. So when you think about what it means to transform political conditions on the ground such that violence won't continue to happen, it's a different way of thinking about what it means to do anti-violence work. So
and Leslie, I think humbly and realistically, we also are, as a movement, doing this work, right, at a very experimental stage. So, you know, we're all brainstorming, like we did in this class, what the end point is, what it means to be successful at this, where we want to go with this, how to sort of brainstorm or emerge what our goals would be, right? So I think that creativity is a very important aspect of where this work is now. But I think we were only able to sort of get to sort of thinking about that through the practice of it, right? So the practice brings up all these new lessons and questions that otherwise might not be emerging, right?
And you know, we just have this short opportunity here to share some of the conceptual work, but also a couple of examples. There are more stories and more examples of concrete things that were successful in some areas that the examples that we gave may not have been. So, and my guess is there are people here that have experiences or are building them right now. So this is kind of an encouragement for all of us to figure out ways that we can keep connecting and building upon what we've been doing already.
All right, this is it. Thank you very much. We're concluding the panel. Thank you.